Welcome to My Money Mindset podcast, where we explore how a healthy mindset is the foundation for financial success. Each week, we delve into mindset hacks and practical strategies to help you enhance your income, help you make more appropriate investments for yourself, and to improve your overall financial well-being. Join us on this journey to transform your financial future by transforming your mindset. Please note that the information provided on this podcast is for general information purposes only and does not constitute as personal, financial or health advice. It has been prepared without considering your individual objectives, financial situation or life needs. Before making any financial or health decisions, you should consult with a qualified professional or financial advisor to ensure the information aligns with your specific circumstances. So let's begin and enjoy this journey as each episode teaches us on how to improve our overall mindset that overall improves our financial success. Hello everyone and welcome to a new episode, Money Mindset. Today I wanted to talk about the impact of the US tariffs that we see on the news, yeah? So what do the US tariffs have on Australian business? Now, this isn't the sort of stuff that I really get heavily involved simply because most of my clients, although they're in businesses and operate large amounts of investment or one investment property or anything like this, does it affect them? Well, in some way it does eventually. It's not a direct impact, but it's always nice to know. So I did have a few clients always saying, with anything happening with the cash rate at the moment, we are expecting cash rates to go down. So hold our breath there. When they do, we take advantage of them. But going back to the US tariffs and the Australian cash rate, sort of the interplay between the US tariffs and the Australian cash rate, it creates a complex environment and there's various effects that this will have on Australian businesses or properties that we are in real terms, right? So I'll break it down. Look, realistically, with the US tariffs that are being placed on Australian business, it sort of will increase costs and reduce competitiveness. So what that means is basically the 10% tariff on most Australian goods entering the US now, so our exports, it's sort of going to directly increase the cost for the American importers. While not paid directly by Australian businesses, this can lead to sort of a lower demand. So if you can imagine that the American importers are basically buying in Australian goods at a higher rate, US buyers are probably going to switch to domestic products, as in rather than the imports from Australia. So they're going to try and sell their stuff locally, which is going to be a lot cheaper, right? So it's a bit of a demand and supply problem here, because obviously when we export to the US, it's going to have I think it's around 10%, a tariff that's being placed on our goods. Then basically the consumer in America is going to find that this is obviously 10% more dearer and go to another product that's a lot cheaper, right? Simple. And it's also going to reduce profit margins. So the Australian exporters might have to lower their prices if they want to remain competitive. And obviously that affects their profitability. So it's not a good sign, as in to say, well, why are they doing this? And simply it's because they're trying to incentivize the consumers in the US to obviously buy more local to create more jobs within the US, in simple terms. And there's a lot of other benefits to it for the US. The other thing is also disrupted supply chains and higher operational costs, meaning that Aussie businesses, we're a part of a global supply chain involving US tariffs on goods from other countries such as China, right? And they can increase, and the costs of the inputs for Australian manufacturers, it leads them to higher production costs, which is not good for Australian business, obviously the ones that are exporting to the US. And the repercussions of this is, look, the trade diversion and increased competition. The US imposes tariffs globally, right? Because they're bringing in these tariffs. Goods may be diverted away from other markets, including us, as in Australia, and that will simply lead to just a surge of cheaper imports, meaning that obviously if we're receiving cheaper stuff from overseas, our Australian manufactured goods are obviously not going to be as cheap or as competitive in price, and it will affect Australian businesses. So it's probably not a good thing in that sense as well. Australia wants to be competitive enough. They're sort of going to say, well, we're going to have to drop our prices, in other words, and profitability will also drop with that, right? So Australian businesses obviously not making enough profit or will have reduced profit, yeah? And just like interest rates or Australian interest rates, if they're unpredictable, stuff like that, the same goes for when it comes to trade, as in international trade. Uncertainty and reduced investment means it's an unpredictable nature of international trade policies. So for instance, if we're thinking that these tariffs are going to increase and we don't know, small to medium enterprises and businesses within Australia will sort of hesitate to continue investing simply because of the economic uncertainty of what these tariffs are doing. So if they're anticipating that there will be an increase in tariff from the US or other markets, and it's going to affect their manufacturing, or the amount of manufacturing is going to lower, then obviously these businesses aren't going to invest in other goods or manufacturing, supplies, equipment, workforce, that sort of stuff. Now that's the doom and gloom part of it. There are some other upsides to it, so which would sort of mean that let's go with the 10% tariff on all Australian goods. That's actually lower than tariffs imposed in some other nations, right? Which means that the Australian products can be relatively more attractive to the US market in specific sectors simply because they will be cheaper, because Australia's only copping the 10%. Other nations are copping higher tariffs depending on what those specific sectors are. And that being said, the UF tariffs might also accelerate Australian businesses' efforts to diversify their export market. So in other words, reducing their reliance on the US to export and exploring better opportunities in regions with free trade agreements, right? So, or less than 10% trade, 10% tariffs that are placed on the Aussie exports. So attracting foreign investment, let's say global economic uncertainty caused by tariffs, could make Australia with a more stable economy, because they're simply going to get a lot more other places to export, a more appealing destination for foreign investment, that sort of thing. Increased competitiveness of Australian goods, a weak Australian dollar potentially influenced by trade or global tensions can make Australian exports more price competitive in the markets outside the US. So this is what I'm saying. It can drive the fact that even though we're going to be copping a 10% tariff with the US, we can actually get other places and explore other places around the world to buy our Australian exports, right? So it's something that our government and our businesses have to start exploring, as in diversifying where they can actually sell their goods to, right? Start exporting more. Now, on to the Reserve Bank cash rate that we're waiting for to obviously lower rates, hopefully. We haven't been holding our breath, but the Reserve Bank of Australia, the RBA cash rate, hopefully the cash rate does drop down, and lowering the cash rate, as what we've just seen recently back in February 2025, was reducing borrowing costs, right? Win-win. It increased the availability of more credit. Win-win. Boosting our consumer spending, obviously because they got a lot more money, through lowering mortgage repayments. So if your mortgage repayments are somewhat $3,000 a month and it drops it down to $2,850 or thereabouts, and it's even $150 a month saving, God bless, give that $150 to the kids per month than rather give it to the bank. And this is what this boosts consumer spending, right? Who wouldn't want an additional $150 in their pocket a month because of a decrease in interest rates? It makes the investment projects more viable, or they look a lot more attractive because of better returns. So if it means that our cash rate, what we're borrowing, we can borrow more because our servicing now is increased because the banks use our income to see how much we can borrow. If our servicing on the borrowing is a little bit more each and every time, it means that we could potentially have a look at looking at buying a property or more properties or more projects and making the economy flourish, right? Getting more builders out there, more workers out there, everything. You know, to build a house, it takes an architect, takes all tradespeople, you name it, and it just cultivates a lot more economic activity. So it is a win-win if these rates come down. And it can also make, in some way, it potentially weakens the Australian dollar, obviously, because the cash rate's going down, right? This makes our exports even more competitive. So going back to that 10% tariff that's being introduced into America, from America to Aussie, it just means that, well, if our cash rate drops down, well, guess what, guys? It means that it'll make our exports even more competitive in price. So if the manufacturing is actually going out to a larger audience globally rather than just focusing on a US or, you know, something like that, it means that we can actually increase our exports and bring a lot more work into the country. So let's hope they do that. So realistically, a combined impact on the property market for business from the US, it sort of influences the commercial property market in several ways, and that's through US tariffs can create economic uncertainty, like I was saying before. It dampens the business confidence. It leads to slower economic growth, right? So this is going back to that the US tariffs and what it can do to our properties. It sort of reduces demand for commercial properties, say your office spaces, retail, warehouses, and that is something that can affect Australia. So this is where now the RBA have to really start focusing on, do they want to bring the cash rate down? Simply because if this US tariffs makes too much uncertainty and potentially dampen a lot of business confidence, then we need something to create confidence within our local markets, right? And that means give the consumers or the investors that confidence. Cash rate and borrowing costs for property development and investment. Mate, this is a higher cash rate increases the cost of financing for property developers and investors. We don't want this to happen simply because it slows development, right? We're seeing that in COVID. When development approvals in local councils were getting knocked back because we didn't know what was going on as far as lockdowns and stuff like that. Victoria copped it a whole lot harder than a lot of other states, and it slowed development. It increased the borrowing costs, and banks were just rejecting it, saying, and there were some banks that were rejecting hotel developments. It was across the board. And still to this day, a lot of the banks are still affected, believe it or not, as taking on certain securities in the commercial sector. So this 10% tariff is going to cause a little bit of a riffraff in that environment. So investors probably might demand higher yields to compensate for increased finance costs. So that, in a sense, if they're asking for a higher yield in the investment, it'll probably cool the investment off because it takes the profit out of the investment, right? So another sort of lose-lose environment that. So all in all, I think it's one of those things that, look, the US, their tariffs, and it does pose a risk to Australian businesses if not managed correctly. I think the risk to Australian businesses through increased costs, right? 10%. Australian businesses are going to have to either diversify selling their goods elsewhere or lowering their price, dropping their prices, right? And that reduces profit margin. All in all, I think if the Australian businesses, they sort of really need to carefully navigate these sort of macroeconomic influences, right? They need to focus on their cost management, market diversification, and really good financial planning. They need to have a look. It doesn't mean if you're a one-man band or large organizations, it's the same thing across the board. At the end, it's your profit margin that is getting impacted. If it is getting impacted, you really need to be cautious of this. We really need everyone in Australia to start focusing on making sure that we become just as competitive, if not more competitive, by diversifying and selling our goods or exporting our goods to a larger market outside the US. We need to remain competitive. Obviously, the US tariffs, or the 10% that we're copping, the US are placing these tariffs are simply just to cultivate more economic activity within the US, right? So once again, when these sort of things happen, just like if it was in your own household, you need to look after your own household. Let's hope the interest rates do drop down. Now, the wonderful thing, without all just the doom and gloom, the wonderful thing when the cash rates drop down, I believe they should be dropping down, hopefully soon. How much by, who knows? What I always say is probably don't focus so much on that cash rate, but do focus on trying to tie up loose ends. So if you are looking at thinking about doing something with it, speculate. If it means that we've got to wait for this cash rate to drop and then hit it, then we do. Also, when there is a rate drop like this, we get a lot of competition in our local banks, meaning that we just don't have to go for the four majors who are making massive profit. We want to have a look at other competitive banks out there. A lot of the time, the banks can offer cashback incentives. So that means if you refinance with them and get a certain product, they give you $500, $1,000, whatever it might be. Sometimes up to $4,000 we've seen in the past, as in cash back, right? And that's just for refinancing. So that means you do reduce the cost of your interest rate and you do get cash back. And that's obviously case by case, but it is happening. I would not start to sort of worry too much about this US tariffs unless you're exporting a massive amount of your goods, but it is an impact. So I would worry about it, but not worry about it so much as what I would be worried about, what's going out of your pocket directly from your household. So have a look at that, guys. I hope it helps. I tried to sort of make this episode a little bit more understandable with what's going on around the world. Does it impact us? Yes, it does. But like I always say, look after yourselves. Make sure that you aren't overpaying too much and that you're on it, you're working and you're diversifying. And if you are a small business, diversification, call me up, ring me, do whatever, and let's start getting more work out there. If the this US tariff is going to affect you, let me know. And all the best, guys, and I hope you enjoyed listening. Thank you.